So, good afternoon, everybody. I'm glad to host today Orli, Oren Kolbinger. She is an assistant professor of law at Superior Academic College School of Law, where she teaches tax law, advanced tax courses, judicial decision-making, and criminal procedure. Orli was previously a visiting assistant professor and a fellow in law, business, and economics at the Villanova University Charles Whittier School of Law, where she taught federal income taxation and tax policy. She also visited the University of Michigan Law School in Ann Arbor as a research scholar. Orli is a PhD scholar in law from Bar-Ilan University, LLM, LLB in law, and BA in economics, all from the University of Haifa. And her recent work has been published or is forthcoming with the law review and peer-edited journals, including Staten Hall Law Review, Loyola University, Chicago Law Journal, Florida Tax Review, New York Journal of Legislation and Public Policy, and the Journal of Industrial Economics. Orli will present today her last paper, who's about to be published, on the role of tax courts during economic crisis. This is how it's connected to the Nervous Center for the Rule of Law under Extreme Conditions. So Orli, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. So good afternoon, everyone. It's nice to see familiar faces and getting to know new faces. And I hope we can get together at another opportunity in person. So today I will be presenting my forthcoming paper, which is currently titled "Should Tax Judges Think About the Economy?" And this paper is forthcoming at the Seton Hall Law Review. And this project is focused on economic crisis. And not only economic crisis, but it intersects with judicial decision-making. So if I'm thinking about, how can we address questions that are related to judicial decision-making, we can take several approaches. So, empirically speaking, but if we're thinking of the theories that are connected to this topic, we can find ourselves thinking about judicial decision-making theories that have nothing to do with economics. So in this paper, I'm taking a different approach. I'm offering a framework of analyzing judicial decision-making during crises. And because I'm a tax scholar, I'm focusing on tax decisions or tax judges, tax courts, depending on the jurisdiction. And because, my previous work was empirical, and I have empirical findings about how judges perform or act, tax judges, during economic crisis, I wanted to elaborate or try to bring together or design a theoretical framework that will allow me to conduct additional empirical studies. And this is where, myself and the center are connected, because following this paper, I'm working on an additional empirical paper that will focus on judicial decision-making in tax before and after actually the COVID crisis. And I will see how my theory, if it stands, if it holds, in the real world. But before we will get to the future study, I'm going to share with you the current framework. So if we're thinking about the outline of the paper or the structure of my proposal, I will start by describing the motivation for writing this paper or focusing on the problem. I will explain why it is a problem, and I will share my proposed analysis. And this analysis is focused on tax judges. So if we're thinking about the problem here, I think it's pretty intuitive, because, we are currently living through an economic crisis. It feels like, or it looks like, seems like a crisis is just like following another crisis in the economy, not only in Israel, but throughout the world. And if we're thinking about the usual ways that governments handle economic crisis, it's pretty certain that there is some sort of a consensus that fiscal stabilization is the way to go. Of course, we can talk about monetary policy, but I'm leaving it aside because usually monetary policy is, of course, different than fiscal policy, and it has nothing to do with the tax world. And I'm focusing here on fiscal policy and tax. So given that we can stabilize the economy or try to stabilize the economy by using fiscal stabilizers, there are pros and cons of using these stabilizers, and I will elaborate a little bit more down the line during this presentation about these issues with fiscal stabilizers that focus usually on or mostly on the potential inaccuracies, and the costs of designing these stabilizers. Why it is a problem? I think this is also pretty intuitive. I will describe or talk a little bit more about discretionary stabilizers and automatic stabilizers and their advantages and disadvantages. And I will focus on this tension between accuracy and the cost of the stabilizer. Because again, we have this trade-off between cost and accuracy, of course. And if we want to design accurate fiscal stabilizers, usually they cost a lot of money, or only the design will cost us a lot of money, and maybe it's not going to be accurate, as I will describe. So, like a macro econ 101, the business cycle. The business cycle is an economic phenomenon, a macroeconomic phenomenon that focuses on the aggregate demand and the output throughout a cycle, a certain cycle. So if we're thinking of the way the economy or the macroeconomy behaves, we have this upward line that represents output, because over time we have empirical evidence that output grows over time. But there are certain deviations from this steady state of this level of output. So if we're deviating upwards, this is called an expansion. If we're deviating downward, this is called a recession, and this is what we're seeing, as of today. So what does it mean, being at a recession, that the economy is going through a recession? It means that there is too little consumption. So the level of output deviates downwards because people are not spending enough money. And when I'm saying people, that can be the government as well. But we're just like getting farther and farther from steady state because we don't have enough money in the economy to spend. So people are earning less money, people are unemployed, and they cannot go to the supermarket. If you want to use like a figurative expression. So there are ways to handle these recessions, let's say, by increasing the aggregate demand. So we can increase the aggregate demand by adding more consumption. How do we do that? We provide stipends to the people, like unemployment funds. We can have the government enter the economy as a player and spend more money. So if that's the case, we can, push the aggregate demand upwards, and the level of output will go up, will rise. And if we're at an expansion, it means that people are spending too much, and that might cause inflation and so on and so forth. And in that case, we will see tax increases or lower stipends, and we will see that the government has, decides to spend less on the economy. And if that's the case, the aggregate demand will get lower and will decrease and will go back to the steady state. Okay, moving forward. So if we're thinking about fiscal stabilizers, we can think of discretionary stabilizers and automatic stabilizers. So if we're thinking of discretion, it means that we are thinking through the design of the stabilizer, which means that it will probably be more accurate. But on the other hand, it's going to cost us a lot of money, maybe, because it's going to be complicated to design those stabilizers. So it means that we're going to spend a lot of money, or some amount of money, just from pushing money from one pocket to the other, and that's going to be a waste. On the other hand, we have automatic stabilizers. They're simple, they cost less money, they're cheaper, they might act faster. If we're thinking of EIPs in the United States, or the specific stipends that were distributed to people in Israel right after COVID hit, Ma'anakei Pesach, just like specific stipends that are given out. These are simple, but they're inaccurate. It means that people might get the money and might spend it, but maybe they don't need it because they have other funds that they can go ahead and spend. So within this trade-off, I was thinking about, how the tax system looks like, because the tax system is not only the legislator or the tax authority. The tax system also includes tax courts or tax judges that implement tax policy. And in that case, I wanted to check, empirically and now theoretically speaking, what about the tax courts? Can tax courts act as fiscal stabilizers? So I'm dividing the discussion here into 3 stages or 3 steps. So first of all, I'm starting with the can question. So first of all, empirically, can they act as fiscal stabilizers? Do they have the potential to act as fiscal stabilizers? And if we're thinking of a quasi cost-benefit analysis, that will be the benefit of having judges act as fiscal stabilizers. If that can get us to a better result, and I'm thinking here about social welfare, and I will say a few words about this measurement of social welfare and what does it mean. This is the benefit of having courts enter this new field of implementation of tax rules or tax policy. On the other hand, if I'm talking about entering a new ground or crossing a threshold and entering this new in this new area where usually the government or the legislator play a role, there are costs that are associated with having the court cross that line. And if we are weighing the cost and benefit of this, this proposal, we might get 2 different answers, right? So in a certain economy at a certain time, and maybe this is not going to happen today, but maybe sometime in the future, somewhere around the globe, maybe the benefit of having tax courts implement fiscal policy in a conscious way and not in like the back of their heads or in a biased way, maybe it's worthwhile if that's going to improve social welfare. But what happens if the cost is so high that the benefit of redistributing the funds between the taxpayer and the government, are lower than the cost? And that is actually the case in Israel, in the empirical findings that I have from the period of time, the time period between 1993 and 2012. If that's the case and the cost outweighs the benefit, I will argue that judges should not intervene and should not consider the macroeconomic environment when they're making tax decisions. However, if we have a different outcome and the benefit outweighs the cost, I will argue, and this is what I'm doing in the paper, in that case, we should have tax court, tax judges cross that line. And we should have them do that, in a conscious way. If that's the case, in the paper, I'm providing two proposals on how to design this tax mechanism or tax stabilization mechanism, and I will focus on one here today. All right. So we said that the first step of the analysis is, can judges act as fiscal stabilizers? So what is the benefit from my proposal? So I think here that the answer is, again, pretty intuitive. It's a yes, because judges or tax judges, when they decide in these disputes, they actually redistribute funds between the government and the taxpayer. And whenever we have decisions that involve money, and one of the parties is going to get some money and maybe going to go ahead and spend it, these decisions have fiscal implications. And we have evidence from Israel, we have evidence from the United States in the tax context, we have evidence from a few other areas in law that, there are fiscal implications to these decisions, and judges take those into account. In addition, I argue here that at least potentially judges can outperform the government in a certain way, in a certain sense, because judicial decisions are discretionary decisions. It means that judges have the case in front of them and they make a decision, about this case, about this dispute. And if they're making a discretionary decision, and this decision should be implemented right away, hopefully we know that sometimes that's not the case, but it means that judges are making discretionary decisions and they are supposed to be implemented pretty much automatically, like right away. So if we're thinking of this trade-off and the pros and cons of discretionary stabilizers versus automatic stabilizers, I argue that we might be winning on both counts here because we have both discretion and a fast implementation. However, this potential, it's nice to have a potential, but the question of whether or not this potential can be fulfilled, it's an empirical question. And this is why I want to conduct the additional empirical study, and I'm using COVID as a case study to see what was the effect of this economic crisis on judges' decisions. So here we need to have more data on what's happening in the tax context. And I can tell you that the empirical evidence that I already collected are that the judges are responding to the business cycle. In the Israeli context, I found that judges are actually acting in a pro-cyclical way. It means that they're acting in an anti-stabilizing manner. And that will, that will help me to make an assessment on whether or not the costs are going to outweigh the benefit. But for now, we have evidence both from Israel and the United States. The judges respond to the economic cycle, to the business cycle, or to economic crises. So that was the benefit, potential benefit at least. But the normative question here is, should they do that? What are the normative costs of having judges cross that line and enter the court of, the other branches of government? So in the paper, I divide this discussion into three parts. So I'm thinking about several considerations. So first of all, the relationship between the judiciary and other branches of government. Then policy considerations within the judiciary, how certain courts will interact with one another when it comes to considering the macroeconomic environment or economic crises. And lastly, the relationship between the parties and the judiciary, because the parties, meaning the taxpayer and the government, are learning something from these decisions. And that will affect the relationship between the parties and the judiciary. So if I'm starting with the first group of considerations, the relationship between the branches. So the first thing that I list here is separation of powers. We know that judges are nominated to make decisions make legal decisions and not to design any economic policy. But here, my argument is that judges are not going to design the economic policy; they're going to implement. And this is why I'm less concerned about the question of separation of powers, because again, as I said earlier, by definition, when judges decide in monetary disputes, they are implementing a certain policy. The second group of arguments has to do with cooperation and coordination with the other branches. How will the court coordinate with the tax authority, the Israeli tax authority, or the IRS in the United States? How will it interact with the legislator? And here, again, I'm less concerned because the argument is not that the judiciary will replace the government or the legislator. It will complement it. But still, it's tricky because we want to make sure that if we have certain decisions that are made in a certain direction, we want to make sure that we're not like spilling the baby with the water, and we're not making too many decisions in a certain direction, and then maybe we're deciding in favor of the taxpayer to make sure that taxpayers have more money to spend, but then we're already at an expansion, and these decisions are actually making more harm than benefiting the economy. If we're thinking of the relationship between different courts or within the judiciary, we can ask several questions. We can ask about the level of specialization that judges must have. Do they need to be economists? Do they need to have any, economic background? Do we need to teach them, train them, to make these decisions? Here, again, we know that judges make decisions, in other areas that they might not be experts in or specialized in, and they can read, certain reports. They can, get some advice on scientific evidence. So not all answers are within the judiciary, and it's okay to get some external help here. But again, this is a question. Another question is, what's the relevant point in time that judges will consider the economic environment? Is it going to be, at the time of violation? I think not, because the time of violation does not matter at this point, because the time of the decision is what matters here, because the decisions are going to be implemented right away. That, of course, raises other questions. Are we creating this incentive to game the system? Maybe, and that's the other thing. Or the next consideration, can the parties play a certain game around scheduling just to get, their decision pushed into a more convenient time? Again, I'm not really concerned about that because the court controls the docket. But if we are concerned, again, this is a macroeconomic point of view here in this paper, and the effect is going to smooth out. So if we're thinking of the micro consideration and the specific party that might get a certain benefit or not, that might be the case. But if we're thinking, on the aggregate effects of my proposal, I think we can be less concerned. Let's see if you're convinced. And the other considerations are, what's the level of cooperation within the judiciary? Do we want the courts, the district court in Haifa to cooperate with the district court in Tel Aviv or Be'er Sheva, and so on and so forth? How will they know about the decisions that one court made and the other, and not the other? And the question of precedent. What precedent has to do here? So here in the context, when I'm saying precedent, I mean that how can parties can plan ahead? How can they know what's going to be where the economy is gonna be at when their decision is gonna be made? In this context, I argue that the change in the economy or a different stage in the business cycle is a relevant fact, which means that the court can deviate from a previous precedent if the economy, if the state of the economy changed. So the court is not going to be bound by a previous decision if the location on the business cycle has changed. And finally, if we're thinking about the relationship between the parties and the judiciary, I was concerned about maybe an advantage for sophisticated parties. Here, again, I'm less concerned because the timing of the petition is external, right? Because when you get the notice of deficiency, you only have a certain amount of, a certain number of days to go to court. So it's not like you can time the petition. But also unsophisticated taxpayers have a higher marginal propensity to consume. What does it mean? It means that, the low-income taxpayers or the average person that will go to the district court and try to fight the tax authority, they might get an advantage and not the sophisticated taxpayers, because if we want to increase the aggregate demand, we might want to give preference to those who are going to spend the money faster. And these might be the unsophisticated taxpayers. But again, this is something to consider. I will skip the last consideration just to get us to the final stage or closer to the final stage. And here, I shared with you several considerations. So several considerations regarding the should question. What are the normative costs of having judges make decisions that take into account the macroeconomic environment versus the potential benefit of having courts do that? So what will we do if the answer is no? The should question, meaning that the costs that outweigh the benefits. In that case, given the fact that we have empirical evidence that judges are affected by the economy, I think here, and I think this is one of the major points of this paper, we should stop here. We should not move to the third stage, but not only that. Because judges are already considering the macroeconomic environment, and they might be doing that in a way that undermines social welfare, meaning that they decide in a post-cyclical manner, like in the Israeli case. I think that if that is the case, we should have judges stop considering the macroeconomic environment. And if they're doing it, subconsciously, or maybe they have a certain bias, I think it is very, very important to share the information with the court, with the judges, to make sure that they, make an effort not to consider or not to be biased by the economy, because maybe their actions or their decisions or the way they're considering the macroeconomic environment is not promoting social welfare. But if that's not the case, and if the cost, if the benefit outweighs the cost, and maybe we'll find a certain, a specific jurisdiction where that is the case, I think it's worthwhile to have judges play a part in the stabilization game. And how would they do that? In the paper, I discuss two mechanisms, and in my presentation, I want to focus on the first one. I'm happy to take questions on the other one. But the mechanism that I'm developing in the paper is a fiscal multiplier. What does it mean? We know that we have the Keynesian multiplier, which means that, when things shift in the economy, there is an added effect to it, depending on where we are at in the business cycle. So here I'm just using the same metaphor, and I'm advocating for a fiscal multiplier, meaning that once we have a decision, once the court makes a decision in favor of the government or in favor of the taxpayer, there will be a value that will be attached to a simple macroeconomic measurement. Here I offer the unemployment rate, which is, it's a salient variable. It's pretty simple. And it can be, it's going to be technically easy to just like computize it and just have all the data regarding the unemployment rate connected to the computer system of the court. If in that case, when we have a decision, the outcome, the monetary outcome, is gonna be adjusted according to this macroeconomic environment, macroeconomic measurement, and that's going to be pretty similar to the CPI, the Consumer Price Index, and interest rates that are already taken into account by the court system and the tax authority. But here is to add another measurement, and the measurement will work like this. So during times of recession, it is really important to increase the aggregate demand. How do we do that? We make sure that people spend more money. How do we make sure that people have more money? The party who is going to be the party that is expected to spend more money after the decision is going to get that benefit. And the amount of money that the taxpayer needs to pay, let's say that the outcome is that I owe the government 100 shekels at the end of the day, and we are doing a recession. In that case, to make sure that I still have enough money to go ahead and spend, buying groceries in the supermarket, I will get a certain discount in the amount of money that I'm supposed to pay to the tax authority. And that discount is going to be dependent on the unemployment rate. Let's say that the unemployment rate is 5%. I will get a 5% discount on my debt to the tax authority. So instead of paying 100 shekels, I will pay 95 shekels, and presumably I will have 5 additional shekels to go ahead and spend in the supermarket. If that is the case, we can adjust the decisions that courts make. We can do that in an external way, and we can hopefully get rid of maybe an unconscious process that is going on here in the back of the heads, in the judges, in their back of their minds. So instead of doing that, we are releasing judges and ask them to not worry about the economy, because we are actually considering the economy in an external way. And it's going to be more neutral. It's going to be more consistent, and maybe we'll be able to increase social welfare in that case. So we'll end here. I'm happy to talk about future work and next steps and other areas in law that I'm interested in focusing on in this context. And I'm looking forward to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Orli. It's very interesting. And I see Robert has a question.
Okay. First of all, thank you, Orli. It's a very interesting presentation. And I admit tax law was always kind of challenge for me. Actually, I have 2 questions, please. First of all, logically speaking, if the government is in charge of stabilizing the economy, and that should be its policy, as usually when implementing tax policy, also doesn't it say that Generally, the government should win in court because the judges need to take into account because the policy, the stabilization, because logically speaking, the tax authorities should be implementing this policy of stabilization, and their position towards the taxpayers would be, okay, so we're implementing this policy, and this will mean that we'll take more or less taxes from you. And if that's the truth, so they should be always winning in court. That's logically that's what comes to my mind, because they know what's needed to stabilize the economy, and considering it to this specific issue at hand. The other question is more like a clarification to me, like, I'm still trying to think about judges making decisions, rulings, based on law and interpretation. How do they explain that they're taking into account something which is a different context, which is not legal? So they have a law saying that the only question is if someone should pay or not, if the law is applicable, and how do you interpret it? To judge it, how does it look like? You say it's empirical, also a study that you've made. How does it look like? How does a ruling like that is built? What do they say? What do they explain in the judgment? We thought about other things which are outside the equation and decided we should implement it here. So I would really be happy to, even if you can give an example for a good or a bad ruling, that would be great for me to understand. Thank you so much. It was, again, interesting.
Do you want us to collect more questions or answer, how do you...
I think you can answer one by one.
Okay, sure. So thanks, Robert. I will start with the second question. So what I'm doing in my empirical work, I'm doing quantitative analysis. So I'm not focused on on qualitative analysis of the decisions. So I can tell you, so I have a table to share with you. Okay, so from reading the almost 300 cases that I read for this analysis, judges don't say that. As we know, when we have empirical findings about other kinds of biases, judges don't really tell us that they are biased, right? We can find that out, if we look at certain patterns, and over time we can see, usually the government wins, and that relates to the first question, but I will address it in a second. So if we're looking at I don't know if you can see my cursor, but if we're looking at the third row here, the taxpayer appeal was fully rejected. So we can see that, and that means that the government won. We can see that during a recession, the government wins a higher percent of the cases compared with during an expansion. And that difference was statistically significant. And what I find here that there is a difference between the decisions that they make during crisis, during recessions versus expansions. The economic theory will say that during a recession, we should expect that the government will lose. And that relates again to your first question, and I will say that, because if we're thinking about increasing the aggregate demand, we need to get more money to the people. So these are the findings that we have from the United States. So there are a couple of empirical studies that were conducted on the United States Supreme Court. Their theoretical framework was different than mine, but they found that during the business cycle, when during a time of a recession, the taxpayer wins, and during the time of expansions, the government wins. The government wins, meaning that we are taking money out of the economy, and that will get the aggregate demand down. Here in the Israeli context, again, the results were the other way around. During times of recession, the government won. But that means that we're taking money out of the economy. If the government wins, first of all, we need to know whether or not the government went ahead and spent that money as a player in the economy. And this way it contributed to the aggregate demand. Maybe that's the case. Maybe the government in Israel does a better job than the government in the United States in this context. Maybe. We don't know. But we do know empirically, when I'm saying that I know empirically that the government makes different the court makes different decisions during times of recession and time of expansion. I'm using regression analysis, and I'm seeing that the specific stage in the business cycle has an effect on the outcome. And this is like one descriptive table. This is not the regression analysis. I can send you my other paper if you want to read more about that, like the very surprising findings that I have, from Israel. I think the Israeli story is different and unique in that context, because I was intrigued about this outcome. Like, why are we different than the United States? What's so interesting about, there are many differences between Israel and the United States, but why doesn't it fall into place, with any of the economic theories that are at hand? So I went ahead and did some research on the economic history of, the 70s and 80s that led to this pattern of decision making. And if we're thinking about, the post Yom Kippur War and, the inflation, like all the economic problems that Israel went through during the 70s and the 80s, the motto back then was, lower the deficit at all costs. And if that is what the government, the policy that comes out from the government, I think that the Israeli judges that were educated and raised through, during this period of heightened inflation and post-wars, I think that maybe they, absorbed this, this motto or this way of thinking, and they joined forces with the government. And this is what led them. Look, this is the explanation that I was able to find why judges decided in favor of the government during times of crisis. And that takes me to your first question. It was whether or not, like, maybe the tax authority already considers.
The logical cycle. Again, the first question was the logical cycle leads to that the government should always win. That's if the government is implementing the policy.
Exactly. So it's a good question.
No matter when.
Yeah, maybe and maybe not. And I think that, if I had more information about what's going on within the tax authority, that would have been great. We know that these disputes do go to court and the win rate is low. So the win rate is less than 20%. We have lots of, middle, like midway decisions, and I'm putting that aside. I addressed that in my other paper. But here we know that the government usually wins, or the taxpayer loses, whatever you want to, call it. I'm wondering whether or not the tax authority already considers the macroeconomic environment. Maybe it does. I don't know. I don't have access to this data. All the decision-making processes in the, of the tax authority are concealed. Like, we don't have access to the way they're making decisions. Maybe they do. I would love to conduct an empirical study about the way, the macroeconomic environment affects, maybe not, their decision making. But what I can say that the tax authority makes its decisions in the shadow of the court. So I think that if if the tax authority will know that there is a certain expected pattern in which the court will decide the disputes, if they won't settle or won't reach the, more macroeconomic sensible way, that they know that they're going to lose in court. So still, there is a lot to find out here. But I'm not sure that our premise is that the government should always win. Yeah, but thanks.
Also, Limon.
Hi. Well, first of all, thank you. Again, I'm not an expert, in tax law. Like Robert, it's like I don't remember much from when I was at school, at university, but when I'm encountering tax law, I all the time realize how it's so related to social justice. The most fundamental questions are there. So it's really interesting, and unfortunately, I'm not swimming in the. So in a way, I'm looking also at what Robert says, and the nut is like in the premises, right? In the basic assumptions behind. And so in a way, it's just that is my reflection about whether the assumptions that you are taking are the accurate ones, and that the difference between Israel and the states relates to those assumptions about what will prevent, and also what you acknowledge. I think, and I agree with you that the state doesn't need to win all the time, and that's a major problem in our cases, also with criminal cases. I think there are many flaws there. One other thing. So again, the question is a question of policy, and you're going into the court because you have some transparency there, but actually. So in a way, I had a little bit of problem with the framing, I forgot how the exact framing, but in a way saying whether courts should do something, but actually your argument is that they are already doing it, but they're doing it in the wrong way. So maybe framing that as correcting how, in a way, correcting how judges or how courts are approaching that, maybe that's a better framing, because in a way, I think courts are not the best place to do policy decisions, because they lack exactly the information that you're lacking, right? And the tax authorities do have them, or at least they should have them, and they have all the available data, and they can do, and it's their responsibility to do it. So in a way, we don't want to move to courts and say, well, they should do that, but actually they should be a correcting mechanism and not the one that initiates the policy. So this is it. Thanks. Really interesting.
Thank you. I really love this, and I think when moving from the initial draft to the draft that I sent you, and that is forthcoming, I was dancing around exactly, your last point. So are we thinking of like, what is the major, implication of my finding? So, and I think that's exactly what you said. So we have, if we're thinking of this question in a normative way, we're asking the should question. Should we, have judges do things that judges were not meant for, right? We have the legislator and the in the administrative branch, and it should, these branches should design the policy, and judges are only implementing policy. But because we know the judges are biased in a way, and they are considering the economy, there are like different lines here that are operating. So first of all, we have the normative question: should we, have them do that? And we, by asking this question, I'm trying to just ignore what they're doing. But when we are trying to figure out whether or not it's going to improve, this move is going to improve social welfare, I think we cannot ignore the fact that judges, at least in the Israeli case, are operating in a way that harms social welfare. And I think that one of the things that I'm trying to, maybe I need to put more focus on it in the paper. Like I have a short subsection that talks about, judges, if you can do it right, do it. But if you cannot do it right, just don't do it at all. And here in the Israeli case, I think judges should stop considering the macroeconomic environment exactly because they lack the information. They're not following macroecon theory. Maybe it's not the right theory, but this is the economic theory that we have. So that's that. So I totally agree. And because both of you brought up the question of whether or not the government should always win, or the premises here, I will say a few words about the middle decision. So it is a question, like a methodological question on how do you code a win for the taxpayer. So if our starting point is that the taxpayers are the one who are taking the tax authority to the court. Okay. This is how the process works, both in Israel and the United States. The taxpayer is the one who will go to court because the tax authority made the decision and now the taxpayer is trying to fight it. So the starting point is that the taxpayer is losing, right? The taxpayer lost something and now they're trying to get it back. So maybe we can, and I got this feedback from, on my empirical paper, any movement from the initial decision is actually a certain win to the taxpayer. Because maybe we can, act as strategic players and ask for 10 things from the court and be very happy by just getting one. We know how it works. You mentioned the criminal process, and we know this is a huge deal with plea bargaining and how that works. So if we're looking at, just like even a slight deviation from the initial decision is in a certain win for the taxpayer, the win rate is about 55%. And this gets us pretty close to win rates in the civil process. And these are all civil cases, right? This is not, these are not criminal cases. So in that sense, again, maybe I should frame it differently, but the government doesn't always win. And I think that has a lot to do with the way we perceive the tax procedure and the tax process and taxpayer versus the government. But in civil cases, I think we should look at these cases as civil disputes, although with the government, the government is holding our money and not the other way around. Did I address all your questions? Okay, thank you.
Anybody else? Ben, Adil, Talia? I have a little question. Is it possible that there is a factor of what happens before things are getting to court? Maybe the tax authorities are acting differently with the cases in case. I mean, somebody has a dispute with the tax authorities, but they come to an agreement before going to court, and this could be connected to the situation in the economy, or I'm completely wrong. Like, I know that so maybe it's not the fact that the state wins more is maybe not because this is what the judges do. Maybe it's because what the tax authorities do.
Right. So that's going to be like the composition of cases that actually go to court, because maybe the easy cases, like the tax authority will settle the cases, and it doesn't matter if it's during crisis or not during crisis. Only the hard cases go to court. And you're probably right. There is like a screening effect here for sure. But I don't have the information about the cases that were settled in the tax, at that stage. That would probably provide us much more information, probably answer many of the questions that we have in this context, because maybe there is a screening effect here. But I will say, just to, like my thoughts on this issue, what I thought maybe what you're asking is, does the tax authority settle cases in a certain way to make sure that when they will get to court, they won't get like a decision against them, and that will affect many more cases. So that is happening for sure. I'm not sure that the tax authority cannot like predict what will be the decision at the end of the day, or what would be the effect of the economy on the decision at the end of the day, because they don't know when the decision is going to be made. So if the tax authority is thinking about the economy, it makes the decisions depending on the state of the economy at that point, because they don't know what will happen at the end of the road. So maybe they're curbing their chances, or like considering their stakes, and maybe they will provide will be willing to give in more during times of crisis, just to make sure that maybe if the case is going to be decided during a future crisis, they're going to lose. Maybe, but I'm not sure that the tax authority even thinks about future, the future state of the economy, but maybe the current state.
Can ask them.
Yeah, I wish I could.
Well, maybe you can. I mean, do some interviews. Can be interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. Anybody else? Ben?
Yeah. Hi. Thanks. Maybe some rough thoughts. I'm not sure I can really put it in the right words, but I think likely more I was a bit confused. I'm not sure I'm correct about that, but I was a bit confused about the question, should they do it? Also, it triggered my mind to think, are you going to a deep normative direction of ideological wise? Like, will it bring more equality or something like that? Or will it be, there are ideologies around the topics you talked about, but you talked about it from a specific point of view, specific political point of view. So I would love to hear a little bit about your point of view about, do you think there is a specific economical ideology that you prefer? And do you think that your suggestion would be more beneficial in that direction? So maybe the question I'm just suggesting that is more precise is not should they do it, but will the uses of judges as fiscal balancers will be beneficial in terms of that specific political theory, you might say. And another question I have, it's more of a consideration. You're talking about things that are really in the heart of the public debates in Israel now, right? About the role of the court and as policymakers. And we also are witnessing some potential changes in the character of judges, again, in their political point of view. So first of all, how do you locate your suggestion in terms of that specific debate? And do you think that changing the political changes, if it might happen to judges, will affect the way you think about the decision to give more power to judges?
Yeah. All right. So first of all, your first question focuses on, on the theoretical premises of the study. So the theory that guides me here is not political economy, right? It's pure economic theory. So I think that what you're talking about was the heart, of the studies that were conducted in the United States. So in the United States, there are, I talk about these studies in my paper. So Epstein, Stout, and Brennan conducted 2 studies about the decision-making patterns in the United States Supreme Court during certain economic crises. At the beginning, they started off with a theory that a political economic theory that focuses on, the courts combining forces with the government to promote a certain economic policy. In that case, they expected that during economic crises, the government will win. And during expansions, the government will lose because, again, in times of need, everybody needs to join forces and work together to make sure that the economy gets better. Unfortunately, their outcomes were the other way around. So they found that during recessions, the taxpayer wins. So they went ahead with another study. And the theory that they developed in this context was about judges as voters. And I think that, that really connects to or is related to the current debate in Israel. So their theory was that judges act as voters when they make decisions. And if the economy is doing well, judges will say, okay, this is happening because of the government, so the government should win. And if the economy is poor and we have a recession, the government did something wrong to get us to this point. And in that case, they punish the government, judges punish the government, and the taxpayer wins. So that's the theoretical framework of that study, and and that work with the outcomes. So if you're interested, I would advise you to go ahead and read those articles. I'm taking a different approach here. Maybe the explanation that I'm providing has something to do with political history in Israel, but the theory that I'm starting from, it's a macroeconomic theory. So my argument is it's not that judges are trying to promote a certain economic ideology, but judges are following certain economic intuitions. And you can, try to imagine that the judges are maybe following, maybe reading the newspaper, and they're seeing, the unemployment rate is at its peak. This is a good proxy, to the average person that the economy is not doing so well if the unemployment rate is high. And if that's the case, they will follow a very intuitive economic intuition that will take them, to favor the taxpayer, because, taxpayers are now unemployed. We're thinking like of this, a macro way of thinking. Unemployment rate is high, the economy is not doing well. We need to make sure that taxpayers can go ahead and pay the rent, buy groceries, and we will favor them because this is a very, very basic, intuitive, way of deciding. And if I'm trying to connect, this, what I said here to your second question, I'm not sure. I will tell you what I'm telling my students when I'm teaching, this semester I'm teaching a judicial decision-making course. It's taught in English. And we are having discussions. When I planned the course, I did not think that, we'll go through what we're going through, what we've been going through in Israel in the past months. But, that teaching this course, begs the question, right? And we're having these discussions, and I think what I can say is that I think that judicial specialization is really important when judges make decisions. It doesn't mean that judges need to be economists or scientists or criminal prosecutors or defense lawyers when they're making decisions, but we need to push towards specialization. Because when judges become more specialized in deciding cases on a similar topic, they become better at making these decisions. It doesn't make them immune from certain biases. We have a ton of data on that. Still, they're affected by anchoring effect and many other, biases. But I think that it is really, really still important to make sure that the judiciary is going to remain specialized.
Thanks.
Well, more questions? No? Okay, so thank you very, very much. It was very interesting. I'm looking forward to the next paper, and maybe we'll see you next year presenting it.
Definitely.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you. Take care.
Bye, Orli.
Orli, bye.
Thank you.
Bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.